Good morning to all of you who are joining us from Canada and the United States. Good afternoon to all of you who are in our European audience. It is my great pleasure as rector of the Ukrainian Free University to greet our distinguished panelists today. Thank you very much to all that you accepted our invitation to participate in this discussion. I also bid welcome to all our professors, students, and to all of you, our guests who are joining us in this event. Today's session is titled, Mind Mapping Ukraine in Europe, Where Does Ukraine Belong? A European Perspective. It is the first in a series of panels that we are preparing and will be presenting throughout the year in celebration of our university's 100th anniversary. I wish to thank the journal Brussels Ukraine Review and its editor, Dr. Marta Barandi, for entering into a partnership with us in organizing this particular panel. And without further ado, I would like to introduce today's moderator. Alexander Motyl is professor of political science at Rutgers University and at the Ukrainian Free University, where he served for several years as Dean of Social Scientists. He is an expert on Russia, Ukraine, and the USSR. He is author of several volumes that deal with issues of empire, of revolution, and nationalism. And many of you may know him as a political analyst and commentator on Ukrainian affairs and on Ukrainian-Russian relations. Professor Motyl, I turn over this virtual podium to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks and welcome to all the participants. Since we are under some time pressure with regard to Mr. Mikhail Gahler, I will briefly introduce everybody and then pass the baton, pass the microphone to him. Perhaps he can make a statement. I believe, sir, you need to leave very quickly. Okay. So we'll just proceed that way, and then we will open up the discussion to the remaining participants after Mr. Gahler leaves. In any case, we have a wonderful panel, and let me just go down the list, providing you with some information about the participants. One of them is not yet here, but will be here in about 10 or 15 minutes, and that is Viola von Cramon, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Alliance 90, the Greens, and she serves on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and is a member of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee. She joined the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union in 2020. She's a member of the Democracy Support and Election Coordination Group, and she was a member of the German Bundestag from 2009 until 2013. And she served as deputy chairwoman of the German-Ukrainian Parliamentary Friendship Group. Roland Freudenstein is the policy director of the Brussels-based Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. He was at one point the director of the Warsaw office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation and held a leading function in the foundation's office in Berlin. He was also the representative of the German city-state of Hamburg to the European Union. Mikhail Gahler is a member of the European Parliament from the Christian Democratic Union, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Subcommittee on Security and Defense. He serves as a rapporteur of the Parliament on Ukraine and coordinator of the European People's Party group in the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He's an advocate of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and the member of the so-called Group of Friends of a European Ukraine. And finally, Rebecca Harms is a former member of the European Parliament from 2004 through 2019, from the Alliance 90, the Greens, and vice chair of the board of the European Center for Press and Media Freedom. She was a member of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Association Committee and co-president of the delegation to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly. And she's been involved with Ukrainian affairs since at least 2004. I could go on, but I won't, since we're somewhat pressed for time. And I'd like to start the discussion by posing a question directly to Mr. Gahler, since you are, again, the one who is unfortunately going to be leaving us, and that is the following. In its relations with Ukraine, the European Union has never, to my mind, openly stated that if Ukraine fulfills all of the requirements of European Union membership, in other words, if it becomes a model democracy, a model market economy, a model rule of law state, then the European Union would gladly accept it as a member. Why is that? First of all, perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there have been statements to this effect, but why is it that the European Union finds it so difficult to state something that is non-controversial, that an ideal Ukraine would be an ideal member of the European Union?
Well, thank you very much. And sorry that I have to leave so quickly. Well, if there were an ideal Ukraine, I would, for my part, of course, say yes. The European Union has not, so to say, extended any specific invitation or confirmation to any specific state, because we have an Article 49 in the Treaty of Rome, which provides that any European state can become a member and apply for it and become a member if he fulfills the necessary criteria. I can imagine that the argument is not specifically Ukraine related, but overall circumstance related, because as we speak, and we have had this discussion for quite a while, there has been amongst many member states and stakeholders, political stakeholders, quite a reluctance to discuss actively about an enlargement perspective for any state. We are having this discussion even with regard to the Western Balkans, which is an area where we had the Thessaloniki summit at the beginning of the year 2000, when at that state, in principle, so to say, there was an accession perspective granted to the Western Balkans, which is, of course, geographically far, well, it is surrounded by the European Union and not at the periphery. But indeed, what I'm telling Ukrainians in this regard is, you are the bride, you want to be accepted, please make yourself chic for this event and prepare thoroughly. And at some point, I'm pretty convinced that decision makers in the European Union would tend to say, well, we would be foolish not to accept such a strong and stable and attractive state, because it would not be in our interest not to have Ukraine inside. But as we are not there yet, and as we are discussing other issues, and enlargement is by no means something very attractive, regardless towards whom, it is not discussed. But as I said, I would wish that we are coming to this point at some point. And it is certainly, because that is always the hidden suspicion, I would say it is certainly not because of Russia that we would not have this discussion. It is because of the general circumstances. And of course, a lot still has to be done before we can always dream, but not yet speak of an ideal Ukraine.
Well, thank you. Let me just follow up on that, since, again,
yeah.
Unless any of the other participants would like to join in, so by all means do so. But since I have you here for a few more minutes, you know, when it came to the East Europeans, the Poles, the Hungarians, and so on, Europe provided them with a certain kind of perspective for membership. And that was pretty much clear from the very beginning. And it's always been argued, at least in academic circles, but as I understand it, also in policy circles, that the prospect of membership was one of the key reasons for their ability to embark on serious reform. As we know, of course, in the case of Poland and Hungary, that doesn't guarantee backsliding, but nevertheless, it was always taken as a given that the prospect of membership was a significant factor. And here again, as I said, why can't Europe signal to Ukraine that it has a serious prospect of membership?
Well, when we start from the beginning of the 90s, there was, of course, this impression that there are some countries rejoining Europe at a point when they had already been nations independent in their history and a long history, and had been, so to say, taken geographically under the influence of the Soviet Union. Now they are coming back. At the very point when the Berlin Wall fell, there was still the Soviet Union, and so to say, in the first years, there was not this idea to extend it further. Although, as I said, Article 49 speaks of a European nation and a European country, and certainly this criterion is there. I admit, I mean, the fact that there was a concrete accession perspective made, shall I say, some oligarchs in Central Europe suddenly fall in love with the rule of law. Because in all transitional times from East Germany to Poland and further down south, east, we have seen this this time of transition when certain people enriched themselves, and who were those who were in the old system, many of them ended up again on top. But now, at some point with this perspective of EU, they joined the forces who then said, okay, let us embrace the rule of law and let us have a law-abiding approach in order, on the one hand, yes, to secure what we have grabbed in the very transition times, but then to be sure that it is safe once we are in the EU. Now, this aspect of oligarchs grabbing something and having it secured through an EU perspective, that is obviously not yet there. I think that is definitely one of the reasons that some of the oligarchs in Ukraine or in Russia or in Belarus or where you name it still behave like if they were in the Wild East and could make the state or could make use of state resources for their private purposes. Certainly there is this notion, and still I cannot, so to say, overcome it in a way by ignoring the huge amount of difficulties that persist. We are working, and I would say, for instance, if I refer briefly to my report, that we, with the broad majority of more than 3/4 of the members of the House of the European Parliament, passed with more than 140 articles addressing all the areas of reform that are necessary in Ukraine to be fulfilled, and where they are in some areas well advancing, in other areas not so well. I think this is our kind of commitment to make it step by step more probable that there is a credible perspective emerging. That is my point to say. I would wish that this country, like some others, would really put all the efforts of all stakeholders together. And I think we and the real reformers, I'm speaking not the pretenders about them, but about the real reformers across the political board and across civil society and us in the European Union and specifically in European Parliament, we are keen to get Ukraine to a point where at some point it can arguably say, yes, we want to be not only a candidate, but we formalize it. But at some point that the European Union would then be in a position to accept another status than that what we have got at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Gahler. I don't know, do you still have time, or can we?
For a last question, perhaps, if you, but then I have to leave, unfortunately.
Okay, then, you know, we've been talking about Ukraine and partly the European Union. But one of the points you made in your penultimate remarks was very important to me, and namely that the fact that the European Union is currently asking itself whether it wants to expand, whether it can expand, or enlarge rather, whether this is possible, useful in the near term, in the longer term, and so on. Could you comment on that? I mean, because of course this gets to the very issue. I mean, Ukraine may turn out to be a very attractive and very wonderful bride, but if the groom goes on vacation.
Yeah. No, I think definitely, look on the map, look on the globe, look where we are, how many we are. We are now, without Britain, we are 6% roughly of the global population. We still have around perhaps 20% of the world trade. And we afford roughly 50% of all social welfare expenses that are done in the world. So if we want to retain our living standard, our way of living, of organizing ourselves, if we want to do that, we must become stronger. We must become more united on the global issues. Unless we will definitely become irrelevant in the eyes both of friends like the US, and certainly what Russia already tries to divide, to play one against the other as we speak. And of course, China is a systemic rival that also doesn't like our system, how we organize society, and sees us as a systemic rival as well. So if we are not united, we are lost. And I'm confident that we have learned the lesson of history, not only, but also the lesson how to go into a future. There can only be a common future, or there is no future. And in my mind, in the long run, Ukraine should be an active part of our common future.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gahler. That was a wonderful way to introduce the webinar. And I think we're all very grateful to you for raising a variety of important issues that will now set the terms of the conversation for the next hour. Thank you again for coming.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye then. Let me continue. I see Frau von Cramon is here. So we now have the full panel minus Mr. Gahler. I was going to start the discussion today with Ukraine and then move to the European Union. But since Mr. Gahler, we ended the discussion with Mr. Gahler by speaking about the European Union, let's continue with that. And I'll simply ask you to go alphabetically, if that's fine with you. So we would begin with Frau von Cramon, move on to Mr. Freudenstein, and then end with Frau Harms. And the question I pose to you is this: I mean, how do you foresee the European Union in the next 5 to 10 years? And of course, this is a critical issue. I mean, imagine the worst case scenario that there is no European Union, in which case Ukraine's aspirations for membership are resolved automatically. Of course, very few people imagine that kind of worst case scenario. And as I understand it, the arguments tend to focus on whether the European Union should become more centralized, more like a state, or whether it should become more decentralized, more like, as a friend of mine who teaches at Oxford University once said, that the European Union should come to resemble the Holy Roman Empire. So again, the choice is not between absolutist France and the Holy Roman Empire, but it's obvious, it seems to be that it's a question of either more centralization or less centralization. In the second scenario, if there's less centralization, if the European Union comes to resemble the Holy Roman Empire, for better or for worse, let's keep in mind that it survived for 1,000 years, so that's not a bad act to follow. Clearly, there would be more room for Ukraine. Because it could fit into any number of potential concentric circles. If alternatively the European Union becomes more like a state, well, things will be a little more difficult for Ukraine, at least in the immediate future. So let's just go down the list, if I may. Frau von Cramon, if you would comment on that, or anything else that happens to strike you as being important.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to see so many familiar faces with Roland, Freudenstein, and Becker, and many others well known in Ukraine and in the European Union. So it's a big honor to be here on the panel with you. Well, I think it's highly unlikely that the European Union won't exist. I mean, to put this first, I believe I'm not just an optimist, but a realist, and a realist would still stick to the facts. So since the Brits have left, I think the most critical ones and the most skeptical ones, and the ones who were in favor of, let's say, a less integrated European Union, have already, unfortunately, left the institution. I would see that we have, let's say, different forces and different interests in that respect when it comes to enlargement or deeper integration. We have already, let's say, different level of engagement. We have the Schengen Union, we have the Euro. So not everyone as a member of the European Union is member of this and that, let's say, closer part of this integration. And so that works. It's not necessarily the best scenario. I wish we would have everyone in the Euro, or also in the Schengen zone. But even without having everyone on board, it works. So if some or even more states will decide to go ahead and to decide on a deeper integration, that would not necessarily mean that everyone else would leave the European Union. So I would say this is still possible.
We cannot hear.
Sorry, I have to give a little interview on a Georgian TV broadcast quickly because of the visit of the Georgian Prime Minister. I was writing this in the chat. It was a delay because that was scheduled before. If you don't mind, I will return in 15 minutes and then go ahead. Is that fine with you?
Yes, that's quite all right.
Okay,
of
I'm
course.
sorry. It was a big mess today. I will return.
This is the reality of politics. We understand completely. Thank you.
It's not in my hand, but I will come back. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Well, in that case, I mean, let's just pursue some of these ideas. Herr Freudenstein, if you would just provide us with your comments on the future of the European Union and how a changing European Union may or may not affect Ukraine's prospects.
Yes, thank you so much for moderating this. Thanks for having me. Thanks also to Marta Barandi for arranging my presence. Coming back to your question about the future of Europe, future of the European Union, indeed, I think we're not looking at an either more federalized or centralized or a looser union. It really depends on which sector you're talking about. The saying maybe that came up about 10, 15 years ago in Brussels, it became fashionable to say we need to be bigger on the big things and smaller on the small things. In other words, where it really counts and where the member states or even the regions and local authorities cannot solve the problem properly and most sustainably, the European Union should take action and should exercise its competences, or the member states should exercise their sovereignty jointly on the basis of jointly created law. So, I mean, this is in a nutshell the philosophy that I would characterize as the majority consensus, I mean, across the European Union by now. Actually, very few people want a European Union state. In British discourse has been labeled a super state. And this is totally out of fashion, I may say. There are some small political groups that would still talk about this, but they're not relevant. On the other hand, it is completely clear that things like climate change, things like security, and I mean not only external security in the classical military sense, but also justice and home affairs, domestic security. Also questions now of fighting pandemics and you know, coming to terms with digital technological challenges. All these things cannot be dealt with properly on the national level, and therefore we need the European Union. I mean, this is so far, I think, the consensus that or at least the vast majority's view on the future of Europe. And one thing I would like to maybe deepen a little bit what Gahler started. Objectively speaking, there has been something we can call enlargement fatigue. In other words, the feeling that the enlargements of the 2000s came too fast, too massively, in other words, too many countries at the same time, and that the European Union will need even more time than it has had to digest those. And when you, Alexander Motyl, correctly pointed out the backsliding on democracy and the rule of law in the European Union itself, indeed, for many enlargement skeptics, this is taken as an additional proof that we took in too many too fast, and that we should be even more discriminatory. Well, discriminatory in an objective sense. We should be even more careful about further enlargements. And this is a fact. And, you know, if you look at the EU-Ukraine agreements, starting with the association agreement, but continuing with several other, I mean, basically every declaration after a summit contains this formula: Ukraine has a European perspective. Now, this is the beauty of Eurocratic Brussels, that terms like this are what you want them to be. Nothing more and nothing less, as Lewis Carroll would have said. You know, for some member states, such as Poland, the Baltic states, other countries in Central Europe, a European perspective is a code for future membership. For other countries, such as France, such as Austria, recently I would also say Germany to an extent, European perspective means everything else but not membership. And this is what, you know, this is Europe in a nutshell. This is the European Union. It's a constant compromise. So this is what everybody can agree on. Whereas if someone proposed to write future membership into such a declaration, there would be a bunch of member states that would immediately protest against it. So I think to keep the door open, to say that, you know, aside from official declarations, to say that, of course, there is Article 49, as Michael said, and of course, every European country that fully fulfills the criteria has a chance at becoming a member. But we have learned that to give timelines or to make definite promises before decisive progress has been made in at least coming demonstrably closer to the acquis communautaire of the European Union was a mistake. And these mistakes were made in the 2000s, by the way, vis-a-vis some countries. And we believe that we have learned the lesson from that. So, you know, and of course, Ukraine is a European country. There's no doubt about it. By the way, I would say Russia is a European country too. There is no genetic reason why Russians cannot build a democracy. I see some skeptical facial expressions around here. Okay, we can discuss that too. But just like there is no biological reason why Russians cannot be a democracy, build a democracy, there is no biological reasons that Ukrainians cannot build a functioning market economy, the rule of law, functional checks and balances. And here's my last point now. The signals that have been given by the Ukrainian government in the last couple of years have been mixed in this sense. We've had back and forth, we've had ups and downs, we've had, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, whatever you want to call it. But there is no clear movement toward a systematic approach in fighting corruption, in strengthening the rule of law, in strengthening the independence of the judiciary, and in bringing Ukraine closer to a point after which it is possible for the European Union to say, yes, you have a membership perspective, we're going to start negotiations in so and so many years. And these are the next conditions to be fulfilled. So, sorry to be maybe to sound like someone who is overly pessimistic, but I'm giving you the nature of things in Brussels and in most capitals of the member states. This is where we are. We need to make the best of it. And again, I emphasize there is no reason at all why one day in the future Ukraine should not become a member state.
Thank you very much. We'll pursue the issue of what Ukraine needs to do or not do in order to become more attractive for European Union membership in a minute or two. But Frau Harms, would you want to contribute to the discussion regarding the European Union, its future, its appearance, and so on? I believe you have to unmute yourself.
I did it, no. So
Vielen Dank, thank you.
Thanks to Munich and to Brussels, to Maria and Marta for this invitation. I happily agreed to join the debate, and I would like to start with a comment on the future of Europe, or the future of the European Union. From my point of view, without no doubt that the European Union will be there in 10 years from now. I think we have again and again some problems because it's a difficult union, but on the other hand, it's from my point of view and my experience, the most successful supranational organization or union or project in the world. So, and facing problems and facing bigger problems does not mean the European Union will fail. I'm like Mr. Freudenstein, I'm very skeptical about these ideas to create the federal states of Europe. I think there is no real fundament for this idea. There's sometimes a lot of discussion and a lot of noise because it's so easy to get Europe in the focus if you say we are in favor of the United States of Europe. But I see the real successes of the European Union, especially also by guaranteeing the existence of the national state in Europe after the war, and also especially after the collapse of Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact for many, many states. So what to make out of it? This is the real question. And from my point of view, these process which now starts, called the Conference of the Future of European Union, should mainly contribute to make clear what the European Union is for its citizens, what it shall be and what it shall not be. And so this split of responsibilities, this is something what the European Union's citizens have to understand and have to confirm. I think this is probably the most important step to be taken to make the fundamentals of the European Union right now more robust. What does it mean for enlargement, and especially for this case we are discussing here for Ukraine? I think, so if I would be a Ukrainian, I would ask the European Union on 3 points, and I would ask them to come to reliable terms on these points. So first point for me is the association agreements as they are now seem to be projects which can't lead to membership. And I think this is wrong. I think the association agreements have to be changed, and they have to cover the perspective of membership. This is, from my point of view, the real weakness of the association agreements. And the European Union should decide on this. For me, this has always been, since the signature of the 3 association agreements, this has always been the next step to do to get out of this discussion whether there is a membership perspective or not. So the second issue would be about the reforms. And yes, the Ukrainians should ask what happens if we fulfill all the requirements. But this question would be much more serious question and would be taken much more serious if the Ukrainian partners in the association agreement would not always again and again, based on the agreements, would do 2 reform steps forward and then 3 steps back. Or 1 step forward and half a step back. It depends a bit on the different fields of reforms. But Mr. Freudenstein already mentioned the list of reform projects started. And so to get this, positive response from EU for Ukrainians that there is this membership perspective, this is much more realistic if Ukrainians become more reliable in the reform processes. And I know that's not easy. It's a very demanding process. These are very difficult and demanding processes in different sectors. It's Ukraine also who wanted to have this agreement, and it's a country who signed it. And it's for me sometimes really worrying to observe how difficult, for example, it is to do the reform of the judiciary, which is really a key reform for the country to function better for all its citizens. And this debate on the reform of the judiciary started not with the association agreement. It started already during and after the Orange Revolution. And still we are in a very problematic situation when it comes to the influence, the political influence in the judiciary, and the lack of clear rule of law procedures reliable for every Ukrainian. The third point, which matters a lot for the membership perspective, and which has to be discussed seriously also with the European Union, is the war and is the conflict in Donbass and in Crimea. As a member of the European Parliament, I worked a lot on Turkey and Cyprus. So I'm not sure whether the European Union will once again or would once again agree to have a member with a conflict along its borders or on its territories. I would say probably not. They won't. Connecting to what I said first, coming to terms with the European Union on the perspectives means that the European Union and also NATO have to become more serious on the question how to deal in the perspective with Donbass and Russian aggression and occupation of Ukraine. And I'm since the very beginning convinced that saying there must be a political solution is good and okay. But if there is, after 7 years of war, no political solution, then also the European Union and NATO have to revisit their strategies and how they increase pressure on Russia. Because Michael Gahler was right by saying the Kremlin should not decide who is member of the European Union and who not. But with this occupation and the war or conflict, ongoing conflict, Russia and the Kremlin, they have huge impact on the future perspective of Ukraine in the European Union. And so these, I think, are my 3 points I would recommend to debate in between Ukrainians and EU.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful agenda. Before we go to Frau von Cramon for her comments, let me just go quickly to Herr Freudenstein. How likely is it, in light of what you were saying about enlargement fatigue and things of that sort, and the necessity for some degree of ambiguity? You mentioned the case of European future prospects for membership, things like that. How likely is it that the European states would be willing to take Frau Harms's suggestion to heart and rewrite the association agreement in the manner she suggested? Please unmute yourself.
I am. You know what Mahatma Gandhi once said when he was asked what he thinks about Western civilization? He said, "I think it would be a good idea." I mean, that was a mean, of course, now from our today's perspective, it sounds mean about the West, but he may have had some reasons at his time. Anyway, so I think it would be a good idea to write this into a rewritten version of the association agreement. But right now, I don't see it happening. And, you know, I would like to compliment the organizers and of course, first of all, the Free Ukrainian University for inviting 4 non-Ukrainians here, all of whom happen to be German. That's a great compliment to my country, but it doesn't reflect the reality of the European Union and those who decide about EU policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. So, I mean, I'm also sure you would find a French person that is highly forthcoming towards the perspective of Ukrainian future membership of the EU. But the likelihood, for example, if you invited a French person or a Dutch person, for example, or an Italian or a Portuguese, the likelihood would be that that person would be highly skeptical about such a prospect and would maybe, bring forward arguments of, that then the Germans here, whose heart beats more for the Ukrainian cause, would counter with counter arguments. So I'm far from criticizing the composition of this panel, but what I'm trying to say is that you should not preach to the converted. You should tackle those in the European Union and its institutions and those member states and their representatives who happen to be or tend to be more skeptical about any further enlargement, whether it's by Western Balkans countries or East European countries. By the way, I distinguish between Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And Central Europe are the countries that are already in the European Union, and Eastern Europe are, in my view, of course, future member countries. But anyway, so here's my short answer to your question. No, actually, my answer was much too long. But now I would just say that no, I do not see this realistically happening in the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you. I suspected that's exactly what you would have been said, which you would have said, and you did. Before we go to Ukraine and the question of reforms and the reforms it needs to embark on, let me just pursue one of the points made by Frau Harms, namely with regard to the war, and ask Viola von Cramon, to comment on that. What exactly is the solution in your eyes, or in the eyes of Europe, to the degree that there is such a thing, for the war in Ukraine? I mean, how do you unmake the occupation and annexation of Crimea? What is the solution to the war in the Donbass? If it's not military, and it doesn't seem to be military, unless Mr. Putin decides to launch a war, that might work from his point of view. And if it's not political, then what's left?
Well, so many things are being said before. I mean, maybe it sounds very hawkish, but I would always say to increase the price for Vladimir Putin, that the occupation might be much more costly than it is now. But this is true for all the so-called frozen conflict. Most of them are not really frozen. People are dying. In Georgia, they are taking each night a square meter or square kilometer of Georgian territory. They do the same in many other countries. And so we see now they have boots on the ground in Azerbaijan. They have it everywhere. So the strategy towards Russia will be discussed in the near future, I think, once again, especially after all the also domestic developments within Russia, which we could witness during the last weeks and months, but also the support of Lukashenko and everything which takes place in the neighborhood. And we see only one actually winner. We see only one so far being in place, as nothing had happened before. While I don't think it is the strength of Russia, it is the weakness of the European Union and us not making clear what is the price for this. And as long as we extend the sanctions and being ready to speak about and giving press conferences, as Josep Borrell has done a couple of weeks ago, I think it's clear for Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin that they're on the right track. It's fairly easy, and that makes our life very difficult. I mean, there is, let's say, a broader majority in the European Parliament, which is increasingly unhappy with the situation as it is. And especially due to this hybrid war, this disinformation campaigns, the situation around the vaccination now. I mean, everything is so obvious and is so orchestrated and it's so so frustrating. Speaking to the Ukrainian Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago, of course, we have to support Ukraine in terms of vaccination much more offensively and much more, swiftly. While, of course, Putin has sent a couple of doses to the occupied territories in the east, and now they question let's say, Western Ukrainians. Where are your friends? Where is the US? Where's the EU? Who does support you? We at least get Sputnik V. And so this little bits and pieces show a lot that Putin does use every and each opportunity to destabilize the situation even more. He has no interest, not a single interest, to solve the problem. So when you ask me, how can we look for a solution? It's not in our hand, at least not in a, let's say, civilized manner. We have to put much more sanction, much more economical pressure on him. It must be explicitly explained what it means to occupy and to annex Crimea, to occupy the east of Ukraine and all the other territories. But I mean, maybe you have already spoken about that. And since you have a lot of German guests here today, I'm very, let's say, not pessimistic, but uncertain what will be the future, it's at least German foreign policy when Merkel will have left her office. So this is a very critical point. I don't know which one the CDU will pick, but maybe it comes completely different, and we'll have maybe for the first time a Green in office, a Green chancellor. Who knows? Everything is possible, but there is a lot of uncertainties, at least in the Ukrainian bilateral relation, I would say. And what Roland Freudenstein has emphasized, I can only emphasize and stress, the fatigue of enlargement is big, not in the, let's say, German delegation, but apart from the Germans, now the Swedish, some of the Swedish, the Dutch, of course, the French are not very much interested. So if we could give you a good recommendation, really try to reach out to different, let's say, friends of Ukraine who are not so well aware of the situation, and who are sometimes speak about with empathy, but sometimes simply with ignorance and absolutely, let's say, not very knowledgeable about the situation. And it would help if we could integrate some other nations and some other member states of the European Union a little bit more into our discourse of Ukrainians' future.
Thank you very much. I mean, as you were speaking, it occurred to me that in a way, the question of Ukraine and its relationship with the European Union, or more generally with Europe, is effectively really a question about Russia. I mean, Russia is the elephant in the room, and we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about the Europeans, we're talking about the French, the Germans, but in a manner of speaking, it may ultimately really be about Europe's relationship with Russia, or Russia's relationship to Europe. That might actually be the more appropriate way of putting it. And, you know, whichever decision is made by Putin, or whichever decision is made by Brussels, will obviously have a great impact on Ukraine's ability to maneuver, negotiate, and either move 3 steps forward without moving 1 step backward, or perhaps continuing to move 1 step forward, 1 step backward for the foreseeable future. But let me just now shift again. Let's go to Frau Harms. We've been talking about Ukraine. We've been mostly talking about Europe, and that's good. We've talked about Europe and its relationship with Ukraine, and that's even better. But let's now shift exclusively to Ukraine. I mean, a number of you have spoken about the fact, and especially you, mentioned the halting reform process. 1 step forward, 1 step backwards, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And that, of course, is true. At the same time, it kind of, it conceals I think, a certain reality, namely that despite this kind of hesitant forward and backward movement, if you look at Ukraine's progress over the last 20 or 30 years, there is no question, I think, that it's a far better country today than it was 30 years ago. So despite the fact that there seems to be this kind of implied stasis, an implied inability to move forward, and yet Ukraine moves forward. Somehow or other it manages to do this. So perhaps the situation isn't quite as hopeless as it might seem. That said, let me ask you specifically, because when one reads about recommendations for Ukraine, one always hears, you know, it needs more of this, less of that. And there's always an emphasis, as a number of you have pointed out, that rule of law has to be improved. And Ukrainians agree with this, and Americans agree with this, and everybody agrees with this. But the problem, as always, is in the details. How exactly does Ukraine improve its rule of law? What would be the three things it would need to do in order to improve rule of law in a significant fashion? And the reason I mention this is, as you know, there was recently a decision made by the Constitutional Court, which a series of decisions which effectively rolled back a number of the anti-corruption measures. And, you know, I'm not a fan of President Zelensky, nor am I his harshest critic, but he faced a dilemma. I mean, what are you supposed to do when the Constitutional Court, acting constitutionally, subverts the country and its efforts to become more European? And he immediately responded with a series of measures that were arguably non-constitutional. Other people have said, well, you've got to convoke the equivalent of a kind of national assembly where everybody would be assembled and they would essentially rewrite everything. Well, I suppose that's possible, but again, strictly speaking, that too might be unconstitutional. So what exactly is to be done?
This is not only a problem of President Zelensky. I think also other presidents faced the situation that they wanted to do or had thought they had to do something. And often I thought they were right. And they did it against the rules or against the constitution. So this would normally mean that afterwards, you change the law, especially if you have an overwhelming majority behind you or a majority for this behind you. But this never happens. So you can see the recent decision on the cancellation of licenses for the Medvedchuk television channels and the whole story, how they did it. I'm completely fine with the cancellation. But I would, I think it would be much better if Ukraine could start to do these decisions based on rules and based on the law. And why is this? Why this happens again and again, that the president or the government are acting against the rules? This is because you have not achieved a situation in which the lawmakers can really independently and out of the grip of some of the big players in industry and economy, leave them to do what's necessary. I think this is still for Ukraine a major step to go, to split, to cut the direct influence of oligarchs on political decision-making. And for the judiciary, so I know not only cases in the and around the Constitutional Court. I followed over the decades also because people involved me, even if I did never want it. I followed some of the cases in which Ukrainians or also German citizens faced local courts or regional courts in Odessa or in Dnipro or in Bakhmut. So it's the same situation until today in many courts as in hospitals. Without paying bribes, you don't get to even a session of the court sometimes if you need it. This reflects that the independence of the judiciary and working according to the rules and based on rule of law is still a step to be done in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Herr Freudenstein, would you like to take part in the discussion?
I totally agree to everything that was said, and you know, I think the cutting edge in what think tanks are now advising European Union institutions and member state governments to do is to generally incentivize the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian institutions for further reform, or for a more steady reform course, by the old more for more, but also less for less principle. In other words, a stronger conditionality on all additional forms of assistance, of help, of support that can be given to Ukraine, but also concerning market openings and so on. So in other words, all this should be much more strictly conditional upon clear and steady progress in strengthening the rule of law. And you know, I've just looked at a paper from the German Council on Foreign Relations, you know, authored at the end of last year, which claims exactly this, and which has, by the way, 2 female Ukrainian authors. And you know, this is something that I think should be something that we can all agree on here, that, you know, further and stronger conditionality by the European Union tied to concrete progress is not a punishment or discrimination or something directed against Ukraine. It is, in fact, the only probable means and tool of achieving some progress, and also progress in bringing Ukraine closer to the European Union. So you know, I mean, that I would like to emphasize here as the optimal response for the near future by the EU.
Frau von Cramon. Oh, before you begin your comments, I just wanted to tell the audience, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and we'll address them if possible at the end. Yes, please. My apologies for interrupting you.
Oh no, I have not even started. And since I'm disappeared before, it's fine if you interfere. I maybe would like to see this a little bit differently. I wouldn't be too mild. While we see that people around Zelensky are people returning from Russia, having close ties to the Kremlin, and we shouldn't be naive. Those people have an influence on Zelensky's policy and politics. So there is a shift in the direction. There's a shift in the reform agenda, clearly, and what Roland Freudenstein has said, with more for more and less for less, it is more than necessary, because we would like to see this country being on the right track and being on in the right direction, and not turning back, and make sure that this development is irreversible. And we have seen how quickly this can change, how quickly this could be taken back into hands of a very few oligarchs. Even Zelensky tried to, let's say, prevent this from happening. There are many people around him who are surely on the ticket of very, very rich businessmen, and who would like to make sure that the few achievements in terms of reforms, which could be could be done and could be achieved. And we succeeded together with the civil society and with some of the Maidan activists during the Poroshenko period, that this will be would be reversed. And we have to make sure that this will be happen in a larger extent. This is what we owe to the civil society and to the Western-orientated people. That's not about punishing somebody. That's about clear conditionality. I don't want to spend any taxpayers' money in Ukraine, which will then land in the hand of some of the oligarchs, to make it very blunt and to say it very, very directly. And when I see, for example, this highly corrupted Minister for Health, what he has done in the first week of his being in office, this is highly corrupt. And I don't want to see those people being in place. And when we give money to Ukraine to buy and to procure technical equipment for COVID, I don't want to see this money spent 3 times higher on high prices, while the minister takes part of this for himself. And those things needs to be considered and needs to be said loudly. And the people of Ukraine should know this. And this is in our interest, and this is in the interest of the Ukrainian people. And that's why it is important not to look away when it comes to the fight of corruption. And I would like to see that people of Ukraine believe in EU institution, and that's why we have to stay committed on this path and on this right direction. And there are many, many, many examples what we have seen during the last weeks and months where there are figures now on the stage in Ukraine which are not sober, which do not share the same values, and which have a different interest when it comes to energy, when it comes to other structural reforms. Rebecca has mentioned the health problem. Yes, and Poroshenko had started a very well-received health reform. Gahler is very much aware of that, and he has mentioned it many times. That could have been really a successful project, but Zelensky himself was, let's say, being influenced by many people around him and not really convinced about this. And I don't want to go into more details, but that has to do with some business interest of directors of clinics and so on. And if we do not stop this behavior, this is in the harm that will harm the ordinary people, the ordinary citizen, and then they have to pay bribes even more than now. And this is what we have to prevent.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the questions from the audience, and as far as I can tell, there aren't any. There was one to Mr. Gahler, but he's not here. So in that case, let's just pursue the discussion and see whether any additional questions emerge. And one of the things that has changed in the last few weeks, as you all know, is that the United States now has a new president with a new administration, presumably with a new vision for America, for the world. We'll see whether it's better or worse, but so far, I guess we're probably all on the optimistic side. Let me just ask all 3 of you as well, starting with, again, Frau Harms, then we'll move on to Herr Freudenstein, and then end with Frau von Cramon. How does America and its possibly new role in the world fit into this? Can the European Union overcome its difficulties of working with the Americans, the difficulties that it encountered over the last 4 years? Can trust be easily reestablished? Can cooperation be reestablished? And can trust and cooperation then serve to create perhaps something in the nature of a more or less common approach, both to Russia and to Ukraine?
You want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'm on this issue more on the optimistic side. I think many of the decisions taken in Washington since Inauguration Day show that the relations between the partners in the West will improve, have already improved. They are also considering the EU's interests. So there are many, many names in the nominated people, among the nominated people in offices now in Washington, which know European Union, which have been always defenders of the good relations in the West, to say it in brief. I think this all looks very good, much better than I had expected it before the elections. And there are also some differences in interests. And the real question will be how Washington and Brussels and then the capitals of the different member states will be able to deal with different interests and different priorities also in external action. But I think for Ukraine, we will return to a very good cooperation which existed before Trump. So the Western ambassadors, the EU's and Washington's, Canada's ambassadors had a very close cooperation for many years on all the different issues. And I think there will be a kind of a reconnection in this cooperation. And to come back also to the war as a problem, Russia's war as a problem for Ukraine and Eastern Partnership, I think for the EU, it will be good that the United States will be more demanding on this issue and a bit more clear and a bit more outspoken that this is a real problem. It's already for the Germans healthy that on Nord Stream 2, the United States have not changed the position, but are keeping the line and are showing also their limits of acceptance. So I'm optimistic that for Ukraine, this will be refreshment of support. And what I, on the other hand, sometimes fear that is that Ukrainians immediately think the real ally for us is Washington, is the United States. If you really check who is doing what, then you can easily recognize based on the figures that EU and also some of the member states are by far more important as supporters than the United States. What makes the difference is maybe the delivery of heavy weaponry. And this is again something what also the EU should consider as important and maybe also should consider own weakness on robust support for Ukraine facing this war.
Thank you so much, Herr Freudenstein.
Yeah, thank you. I would have never thought I lived to see the day in which a green politician advocates arms exports. But no.
So we can travel again to Donbass together, and I learned a lot.
Okay, we have to have a little fun here. Please, Rebecca Harms, we have to have a tiny little bit of fun here. So no, I totally subscribe to what you said. And I also think that these are good times for transatlantic cooperation on Eastern Europe, not only Ukraine, but also Belarus. And, you know, on Russia, the elephant in the room, as it was called, I think the recent trip by High Representative Josep Borrell to Moscow actually served a purpose. You know, I mean, it really changed the tone, at least in Brussels. I'm not 100% sure about some member state capitals such as Paris, but in Brussels, it is now impossible to talk about some kind of reset, or we need, you know, that more talking to Putin will somehow help. No one is saying this anymore. And so in that sense, I would say we're in a very, very good situation with very good conditions for better transatlantic cooperation on Ukraine and its neighboring countries.
Thank you very much, sir. Madame von Cramon?
Yes, I think that so far the first moves of the new administration was already very valuable, and you could see here and there some pushes and pulls in the Zelensky administration, very helpful. I don't want to go into details there either, but that's a big difference, and everyone is aware of this shift and of this different attitude towards Ukraine. On one hand, there will be much more empathy, there will be much more interest, but there will be also this form of conditionality, which we definitely need, so that we have definitely support when it comes to the fight against corruption and rule of law and restructuring and so on, what we have talked about before. And I'm fully in line with Rebecca. I mean, Berlin is not helpful with keeping the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's interesting to speculate what might happen after September 26th. When the socialist or social democrat might be out of office, but now maybe even not. So there's a lot of, let's say, potential for changes, hopefully, since we Greens were the only ones in the let's say liberal or democratic party portfolio or field who have objected this project from the very beginning, since this is only and serves only to harm Ukraine. I mean, we really have to speak about this. That has no other intention than financial and geopolitical harm to Ukraine. And we had recently a very interesting hearing in our ITRE committee, Industry, Technology, Research and Energy. And the general director said very openly and repeatedly that there is no common and joint interest in this project, and it's not to increase the energy security of the European Union. So it stays like a bilateral business project which harms the interest of the European Union. And I hope that we find possibility without real sanctions, but with the support of Washington, to stop it, to have any kind of a compromise with which then would have an impact on the relation towards Russia. And this would strengthen and surely have, I mean, a bigger leverage on our foreign policy in Berlin, but also in Brussels. So I see a huge difference from now and the time at Trump's term, and I do hope we can continue. We had already some talks with people in Washington, and this is overall only positive. That's very constructive. These are people which are experienced diplomats, think tankers, so you cannot compare the situation with 2 months ago.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question or two. There's one to Frau Harms. While saying that you doubt the EU would agree once again after Turkey and Cyprus to have a member state in war, do you mean that if armed conflict in Ukraine is frozen, Ukraine does not have the perspective of membership? In other words, as long as there is a war, there is no possibility of membership.
So I mentioned this case of Cyprus because I know that there is a serious problem. So Cyprus was invited to become a member in spite of this contact line in Cyprus and the conflict along this partly occupied territory. And EU hoped that this long-standing confrontation would be solved by the membership process and the connected United Nations process, and with the help of Turkey as so with a membership perspective, and Greece as a member state. And until today, you can only see whatsoever has been tried, it failed. So this experience will not, in the next case of an enlargement decision, will not so be a positive experience. And as I already typed into the chat, from my point of view, meanwhile, I'm convinced about it, that Russia occupied partly Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, is connected also to this interest of distortion of this possible enlargement process. Therefore, I would always think that EU has to be more serious while saying it's not Moscow to decide who becomes a member and who not. So if they mean it serious, they have to stand more robust in this way how they deal with Russian aggression and Russian invasions.
Okay, we have one more question, and then I'm going to ask all of you for your concluding comments. You'll all get about a minute or two. But there's a question here. What are some of the achieved reforms in Ukraine that are viewed as being satisfactory in Brussels as moving Ukraine forward towards membership? In other words, what has Ukraine done well in your minds? Frau von Cramon, would you like to begin? Just very briefly, since we're close to running out of time.
Well, I think that everything when it comes to the e-procurement is a big step forward, and it has actually impacted what we would like to see. There is more transparency and policy. There is more also fairness in terms of where do the taxpayers' money go to. There's a different already, and in some parts, different generation of politicians, because they understand that's not just about earning money in politics. It's about serving the people, serving the citizens. So that made a big difference. And also when it comes to the e-declaration, of course, maybe that's sometimes a little bit too tight, because that's a little bit disputable. But in general, that was also a big step forward, sure.
Okay, thank you. Herr Freudenstein, your candidates?
Keeping the economy stable and the hryvnia, stabilizing the hryvnia. I mean, this is not the same as, it's not strictly speaking a reform, but it certainly is something without which any reform is completely impossible. So chapeau, hats off to Ukrainian economic savoir-faire.
Yes, it's a remarkable achievement considering their track record on the economy. Thank you. And then finally, Frau Harms.
So my favorites are the reform of the police, the reform called decentralization. Both are still ongoing. I also very much appreciate the creation of this pillar of anti-corruption institutions in the judiciary. So always again and again under attack, but it's huge. And what I also always mention as huge step is the making of the Ukrainian army. This is always forgotten, but it didn't exist when Russian aggression started. And it's a huge thing what happened, and also from the European perspective. quite important achievement, because how would Ukraine look like if Ukrainians would not have been able to do this? And so there are many so smaller decisions, smaller creations with the support of government and institutions in the field of culture or urban planning and urban development. So I know that Ukraine has changed a lot, even under aggression and in difficult conditions.
Thank you. So, and anyway, it's good to keep in mind that for all the steps backward, Ukraine has actually managed, a number of significant steps forward. We're close to running out of time. We only have 4 minutes, so I'll ask each of you, starting with Frau von Cramon, for your final summation, some comments about the future, something inspirational, if you like. But in any case, the floor is yours, and then we'll go to Mr. Freudenstein and end with Frau Harms.
I haven't expected a big vision now to
it can be a small vision too.
A small vision. Well, I love Ukraine. I've been involving in Ukraine since '96, and I see, of course, in the long run, I see a big difference from where we've started after the independence and so on. And I see new faces, as Rebecca has mentioned. I mean, the decentralization made sure we have more women in politics. I would like to see more women also in a decision-making process, especially in the hard things such as energy and security. So we see there are good developments, no matter how critical we sometimes are in Brussels, but we all love Ukraine, and it's our common interest that we move together in the right direction. And this would be maybe my final words, that even if we are outspoken and direct and blunt and critical, that doesn't mean that we do not love your perfect country, and that we would like to see that even more perfect. And when it comes to, for example, science and research, we see that the new Horizon 2020 program has just evolved, and maybe also in that context, we would like to see closer ties, more exchange, more cooperation in innovation, technology, and so on, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of charging, battery development, so everything where Ukraine is really strong. And when it comes to independence of fossil fuels, especially for us Greens, this is crucial. This needs to be tackled much more serious than it is now, especially in the current government. So all these kinds of, let's say, more sectoral policy would be nice if we could be supported by politicians and by civil society and the business community.
Thank you very much. Herr Freudenstein?
Yeah, 3 points. First, I think, repeating something I said before, don't always preach to the converted. Try to engage those in the European Union that are much more skeptical about any enlargement, let alone Ukrainian joining, than the 4 of us here in this online meeting. Second, a compliment, another compliment. Ukraine has beautifully managed, or let's put it this way, the expat community of Ukrainians in the West, encompassing several generations, has beautifully cooperated and got its act together to help the Ukrainians back home. Having lived in Poland for 7 years, I know that it doesn't always work that well. So that works much better in Ukraine than in some other countries. And third, Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much. Frau Harms, the final word is yours.
So I wished we could help the Ukrainians to regain a positive view for the future. I think what I find a bit frightening right now is to see that so many Ukrainians have to deal with day by day, with the feeling of uncertainty. I saw some recent figures published on these problems, these fears to lose your job. I think the initiatives taken by the European Union should be strengthened. I personally think that Horizon 2030 is good for the young people and for the students. I very much, and I'm engaging myself in this, I very much hope that the ideas of greening the economy, the ideas of the Green Deal, will help to push some visible innovations, which also increase the appetite of Ukrainians to engage in future-oriented projects in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Well, first of all the audience for participating, but especially the speakers. It was a real pleasure. I listened to many of these webinars, and I usually come away thinking I haven't learned anything. I actually learned a lot. It was a very interesting and a very exciting discussion. So thank you to the three of you, and thank you in absentia to Michael Gahler as well, for a really fascinating and wonderful discussion regarding the complexities of Europe, the complexities within Ukraine, and last but not least, the complexities of Ukrainian-European relations at present and in the future. Before I let you go, however, I've been asked by the administrator that all of you who are now on the screen, please show yourself because they want to take a photograph. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so. Okay. All right, I think we're almost there. Okay, I think we can actually do the photograph. Has it been done? Yes, thank you. Well, then again, Frau von Krams, Herr Freudenstein, Frau Harms, also im Namen der Ukrainischen Freien Universität, ich bedanke mich und ich danke Ihnen auch. Das war eine herrliche Diskussion. Vielen, vielen Dank. Thank you,
Vielen
thank you
Dank für
very,
Ihre
very much.
großartige Moderation. It was just perfect. Thanks a lot, and we are all happy to join you once again if you invite us. That was very, very nice.
Although in the future, we will not speak to the converted only.
No, take some French and Spanish or whatsoever. Some more
Exactly.
critical. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Auf
Bye-bye.
Wiedersehen. Thank you.
Yes, to Washington.
Thank you.